The carriage wheels stopped grinding against the gravel, and silence fell over the entire courtyard of Ashworth Hall. Every servant froze where they stood. Every candle seemed to burn a little dimmer. The man who stepped out of that black carriage was known across the county not for his kindness, but for the cold precision with which he destroyed those who wronged him. Duke Alaric Thorne walked through the front doors of Ashworth Hall without waiting to be announced, and the moment his boots touched the marble floor, everyone in the house understood that something terrible was about to happen. Lord Edmund Ashworth rose from his chair so quickly that his wine glass tipped over, spilling red across the white tablecloth like a warning. He had expected this visit for years, though he had prayed it would never come. The debt between their families was old, buried under false smiles and forced alliances, but debts like that never truly disappear. They wait. They grow teeth. "Your Grace," Edmund said, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound calm, "this is an unexpected honor." "Is it?" Alaric said flatly. He did not sit. He did not remove his gloves. He simply looked around the room, at the three daughters standing near the fireplace, each dressed in their finest gowns as though beauty alone could soften what was coming. The eldest daughter, Charlotte, stepped forward first. She was the pride of the family, admired in every ballroom, sought after by every eligible bachelor in the region. She lifted her chin, ready to offer herself as the price for her father's sins, believing, as everyone in that room believed, that the Duke had come to take the finest thing the family possessed. "If you have come for justice," Charlotte said, her voice steady and rehearsed, "then take me. I will not resist." Alaric turned his gaze toward her, studying her the way a merchant studies a piece of jewelry he has no interest in buying. Then his eyes moved past her, past the second daughter Margaret, who stood frozen with fear, and settled instead on the girl standing furthest from the light. She was thin, too thin. Her skin held the pale color of someone who rarely stepped outside, and a shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the warmth of the room. Her name was Lily, the youngest of the three, the one nobody in that house ever spoke of with pride. She was the family's quiet shame, the sister who fainted too easily, who coughed too often, who seemed to exist at the edges of every gathering rather than at its center. "Her," Alaric said, pointing directly at Lily. "I want her." The room went utterly still. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to pause its crackling. "Your Grace, surely you misspeak," Edmund said, stepping forward with a nervous laugh that fooled no one. "Lily is unwell. She has been unwell since childhood. She cannot travel, she cannot manage a household, she is not fit to be seen in society, let alone to stand beside a man of your position. Take Charlotte instead. She is accomplished, she is healthy, she is—" "I did not ask for accomplished," Alaric interrupted, his voice like ice cracking over a frozen lake. "I did not ask for healthy, I asked for her." He gestured again toward Lily, who had not moved, had not spoken, had not even lifted her eyes from the floor. "You took something precious from my family, Lord Ashworth. Now I will take something from yours, and I have chosen. There is no room for negotiation." Margaret let out a small gasp and reached for her sister's hand, but Lily gently pulled away. She lifted her head at last, and for the first time her eyes met the Duke's. There was no fear in them. There was something else entirely, a strange, quiet resignation, as though she had been waiting for a moment exactly like this one for a very long time. "I will go," Lily said softly. Her father spun toward her in disbelief. "Lily, you don't understand what you're agreeing to. This man intends to punish this family, and he intends to do it through you." "I understand perfectly," Lily replied, her voice calm in a way that unsettled everyone in the room. "Better than any of you realize." Alaric narrowed his eyes at her, caught off guard by the steadiness in her tone. He had expected tears. He had expected pleading or fainting or at the very least fear. Instead, the frail girl everyone dismissed as fragile stood before him with a composure that felt almost unnatural, almost practiced, like armor worn so long it had become skin. "You will pack what you need," Alaric said, recovering his cold authority. "We leave within the hour." Charlotte stepped forward again, panic breaking through her polished exterior. "Your Grace, please reconsider." She is not strong enough for this. If something happens to her under your roof, it will be your name attached to the tragedy, not ours." "Then I will make certain nothing happens to her," Alaric said simply, and turned toward the door without another glance at the family he had just shattered. Lily climbed the stairs to her room alone. No one followed her, not even Margaret, who stood at the bottom of the staircase with tears in her eyes but made no move to comfort her sister. That was how it had always been in this house. Comfort was reserved for daughters who deserved it, and Lily had long ago stopped being counted among them. Her room was small, tucked away in the quietest corner of the house, far from the guest wing where visitors were entertained. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a long moment, breathing slowly, steadying herself the way she had trained herself to do since she was a child. Then she moved to her wardrobe and began folding her few belongings into a worn leather case. A handful of plain dresses, a small collection of books, and beneath them, wrapped carefully in cloth, a wooden box she had not opened in over a year. She did not open it now either. She simply placed it at the bottom of the case and covered it again, as though burying something that must never see daylight. As she dressed for the journey, she paused in front of the small mirror on her wall. She stared at her own reflection for a long moment, the hollow cheeks, the tired eyes, the collarbone visible beneath her high-necked gown. She reached up and adjusted the fabric slightly higher, making certain every inch of skin below her neck remained covered. It was a habit so deeply ingrained that she barely noticed herself doing it anymore. A knock came at the door. It was Margaret finally finding the courage to face her. "You didn't have to agree so quickly," Margaret said, stepping inside and closing the door softly behind her. "You could have refused. Father would have found another way." "There was no other way," Lily said, continuing to pack. "You know that as well as I do. I know that you've spent your whole life being punished for things that were never your fault," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "And now you're walking straight into the arms of a man who wants to punish this family through you. I'm afraid for you, Lily." Lily paused and looked at her sister, the closest thing to warmth this house had ever offered her. "Don't be," she said gently. "I've survived worse than one angry duke." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them acknowledged aloud. Margaret's eyes drifted, just for a moment, to the long sleeves covering Lily's arms, to the high collar hiding her throat, and something painful passed across her face, something that looked very much like guilt. "I should have done more," Margaret whispered. "All those years I should have." "It doesn't matter now," Lily said, closing her case with a quiet click. "What matters is that I am leaving this house, and whatever waits for me on the other side of that door cannot possibly be worse than what I have already lived through inside these walls." Downstairs, Alaric stood near the front entrance, arms crossed, patience visibly thinning. He had come to this house with a single purpose burning in his chest, to take something valuable from the Ashworth family and watch them suffer the way his own family had suffered years ago, when Edmund Ashworth's greed and betrayal had cost the Thorne family everything they held dear. He had imagined taking the eldest daughter, the pride of the household, the one whose loss would wound Edmund's reputation most deeply. But something had shifted in him the moment his eyes landed on Lily. He could not explain it, not even to himself. There was nothing about her that matched the image of revenge he had carried in his mind for years. She was not proud. She was not celebrated. She was, by every account he had heard whispered in society circles, a burden the family tolerated rather than valued. And yet, something about the way she had looked at him, steady, unflinching, almost as though she welcomed whatever cruelty he intended to deliver, had unsettled him more than any tears or protests could have. When Lily finally descended the staircase, case in hand, the entire household gathered to watch her leave. No one embraced her. No one wished her well. Her father stood rigid near the study door, unable to meet her eyes, ashamed not of what he had allowed to happen to her, but of what her departure would mean for the family's standing. Charlotte turned away entirely, unable to bear the sight of her sister walking toward a fate she herself had been spared. Only Margaret stepped forward, pressing a small folded handkerchief into Lily's hand before pulling back, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Lily walked past them all without a single backward glance. She had learned long ago that looking back only made leaving harder, and she had no strength left to spare on grief for a family that had never truly claimed her as their own. Alaric offered his hand to help her into the carriage, a gesture more habit than kindness. Lily hesitated only briefly before accepting it, her fingers cold and thin against his gloved palm. As she settled into the seat across from him, she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the evening was not particularly cold. The carriage door closed. The horses began to move. Ashworth Hall grew smaller behind them, swallowed by the darkening countryside, until it disappeared entirely from view. For a long while neither of them spoke. Alaric studied her from across the carriage, searching her face for some crack in her composure, some sign of the fear he had expected to find. But Lily simply stared out the window, her expression unreadable, her hands folded neatly in her lap, hidden beneath the long sleeves of her gown. "You seem remarkably calm," Alaric said finally, breaking the silence, "for a woman being taken from her home as punishment for her father's crimes." Lily turned to look at him, and for a brief moment something flickered behind her eyes, something old, something guarded, something that had nothing to do with him at all. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "you would be surprised how little punishment frightens me." The carriage rolled on into the night, carrying them both toward a future neither of them could yet imagine, while behind her calm expression, Lily carried secrets far heavier than anything the Duke had come to deliver. The road to Thorn Manor stretched longer than Lily had expected, winding through hills that grew darker and wilder the further they traveled from Ashworth Hall. She watched the shapes of trees pass by the carriage window, their branches reaching upward like tired arms, and she found herself grateful for the silence that had settled between herself and the man sitting across from her. Alaric had not spoken again since his last comment, and she had not offered him any further explanation. She had learned long ago that silence was often the safest place to hide. When the carriage finally slowed, Lily leaned forward and caught her first glimpse of Thorn Manor rising against the night sky. It was nothing like Ashworth Hall, with its warm lanterns and carefully tended gardens meant to impress visitors. Thorn Manor stood tall and severe, its stone walls dark and unwelcoming, its windows mostly unlit except for a few scattered points of candlelight near the upper floors. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something inside. A row of servants stood waiting at the entrance, their faces carefully blank, trained not to react no matter what arrived at their master's door. Lily stepped down from the carriage on unsteady legs, her body aching from the long journey, and gripped the handle of her case tightly to keep her hands from trembling. "This is Mrs. Whitfield," Alaric said, gesturing toward an older woman standing near the front of the group, her gray hair pulled back into a tight knot, her eyes sharp and assessing. "She manages the household. You will answer to her for anything you require." Mrs. Whitfield stepped forward and studied Lily for a long moment, her expression difficult to read. There was no cruelty in her gaze, but there was no warmth either, only a careful, measuring curiosity, as though she were trying to understand exactly what kind of guest had just arrived beneath her master's roof. "Welcome to Thorn Manor," Mrs. Whitfield said finally, her voice polite but distant. "I will show you to your room." Alaric said nothing further. He turned and disappeared into the house without another word, leaving Lily standing alone with a woman she had never met, in a place she knew nothing about, carrying a past she intended to keep hidden from everyone within these walls. Mrs. Whitfield led her through a long corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, their painted eyes seeming to follow Lily as she passed. The manor was grand, certainly, but there was a coldness to it that no amount of fine furniture or polished floors could disguise. It felt less like a home and more like a place where warmth had once existed and then been carefully, deliberately removed. "You'll be staying in the East Wing," Mrs. Whitfield explained as they climbed a narrow staircase. "It's quieter there. His Grace prefers guests to have their privacy." "Guests," Lily repeated softly, almost to herself. Mrs. Whitfield glanced back at her, something unreadable passing across her face. That is what he called you when he informed the staff of your arrival, she said carefully. Whatever business exists between his grace and your family, that is not my concern, nor will it be discussed among the staff. You will be treated with the same respect given to anyone under this roof. It was a small kindness, but Lily felt it settle strangely in her chest, unfamiliar and slightly unwelcome. She was not accustomed to respect. She had spent so many years learning to expect the opposite that she did not quite know what to do with it now. Her room, when they finally reached it, was simple but comfortable: a modest bed, a writing desk near the window, a small fireplace already lit against the evening chill. It was nothing like the grand guest chambers she had glimpsed briefly through open doors along the corridor, but it was more than she had expected, and far more than she felt she deserved. "Dinner will be sent up to you this evening," Mrs. Whitfield said, moving toward the door. "His Grace assumed you would prefer to rest after your journey rather than dine formally on your first night." "Thank you," Lily said quietly, and meant it. Once the door closed and she was finally alone, Lily allowed herself to sink onto the edge of the bed, her body suddenly heavy with exhaustion. She sat there for a long while, staring at nothing, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was not her own, footsteps in distant corridors, the faint creak of old wood settling, the wind pressing against the window panes. Eventually, she rose and unpacked her case with slow, careful movements, placing her few dresses into the wardrobe and her books on the small shelf beside the writing desk. When she reached the bottom of the case, her fingers brushed against the wooden box she had wrapped in cloth back at Ashworth Hall. She hesitated for a long moment, then lifted it out and set it gently on the desk, though she did not open it. She simply looked at it, her expression unreadable, before sliding it into the bottom drawer and closing it firmly. That night sleep did not come easily. Lily lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the manor breathe around her, her mind circling back again and again to the look on the Duke's face when he had first pointed at her in that room full of family who valued everything about her except her presence. She had expected many things from this arrangement: cruelty, neglect, perhaps even open hostility. But she had not expected the quiet, careful distance he had shown since their arrival. It confused her more than outright cruelty would have. Cruelty, she understood. Cruelty had rules. This uncertain kindness felt far more dangerous. The following morning, Lily woke to soft light filtering through the curtains and the sound of birds somewhere beyond her window. For a brief, disoriented moment, she forgot where she was, and something close to peace settled over her before memory returned and reminded her of everything that had changed. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown with long sleeves and a high collar despite the mild warmth of the morning, and made her way downstairs, uncertain of what was expected of her. She found Mrs. Whitfield in the main hall, overseeing the staff as they prepared for the day. "His Grace has asked that you join him for breakfast," Mrs. Whitfield said, gesturing toward a set of double doors leading into a bright dining room. "Though I must warn you, he is not known for pleasant conversation in the mornings." Lily managed a small, faint smile, the first genuine expression she had allowed herself since leaving Ashworth Hall. "I am not particularly known for it either," she said. Something almost like amusement flickered across Mrs. Whitfield's face before she composed herself and returned to her duties. Lily entered the dining room to find Alaric already seated at the head of a long table, a newspaper held in one hand, a cup of untouched tea steaming beside his plate. He glanced up briefly as she entered, his expression giving away nothing, then gestured toward the seat nearest him without a word. She sat carefully, folding her hands in her lap, unsure of what conversation, if any, was expected of her. For several long minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft rustle of newspaper pages and the occasional clink of silverware as a servant refilled Alaric's tea. "You slept well, I trust," Alaric said finally, not looking up from his paper. "Well enough," Lily replied. "You will find the manor quiet," he continued, still not meeting her eyes. "I do not entertain often, and I expect you will have little interaction with anyone beyond the staff and myself." "That suits me," Lily said honestly. At this, Alaric finally lowered his newspaper and looked at her properly, studying her with the same careful, assessing gaze he had used the night they met. "Most women in your position would find that arrangement lonely," he said. "Most women in my position have not spent their entire lives being told their presence is unwanted," Lily replied evenly. "Solitude does not frighten me, Your Grace. I have had a great deal of practice with it." Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to both. He set the newspaper aside entirely and regarded her with new attention, as though reconsidering something he had assumed settled the night before. "Your family spoke of you as though you were made of glass," he said slowly. "Fragile, sickly, unfit for society." "My family has said many things about me," Lily said, her voice carefully controlled. "Not all of them were kind, and fewer still were true." Alaric leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself not to. "Then tell me, Miss Ashworth, what is true?" Lily held his gaze for a long moment, weighing exactly how much of herself she was willing to reveal to a man who had, only a day earlier, been a stranger determined to use her as an instrument of revenge against her own family. "That I am stronger than anyone in that house ever gave me credit for," she said finally, "and that I intend to survive whatever it is you brought me here to endure." The words hung between them, quiet but unmistakably firm. Alaric said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her with an expression she could not quite name. Then slowly, he reached for his tea and took a sip, breaking whatever tension had built between them. "We shall see, Miss Ashworth," he said finally. "We shall see." Over the following days, a strange rhythm began to form between them. Alaric kept mostly to his study, occupied with matters of the estate, while Lily spent her hours exploring the quieter corners of the manor. The library with its towering shelves of untouched books, the small garden tucked behind the eastern wing where wildflowers grew in careless, beautiful disorder. She rarely encountered Alaric outside of their shared breakfasts, and when she did, their conversations remained brief and carefully guarded on both sides. Yet Lily began to notice small things she had not expected. The way meals appeared at precisely the times she preferred, quietly adjusted after only a few days without her ever having said a word. The way the fire in her room was always lit before she returned to it in the evenings, regardless of the hour. The way Mrs. Whitfield seemed to be gently, deliberately including her in the rhythms of the household, as though testing whether Lily might allow herself to feel, even briefly, that she belonged somewhere. She did not trust it. She could not afford to trust it. Kindness, in her experience, was rarely offered without eventually demanding something in return, and she had already given enough of herself to people who claimed to care for her only to discover, too late, that their care came with conditions she could never satisfy. One evening, nearly a week after her arrival, Lily found herself unable to sleep and made her way quietly downstairs, drawn by the soft golden light spilling from beneath the library door. She pushed it open carefully, expecting to find the room empty, and instead found Alaric seated near the fireplace, a book open in his lap, though his eyes were fixed not on the pages but on the flames before him. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I did not mean to disturb you," Lily said, already turning to leave. "You aren't disturbing me," Alaric said, his voice quieter than she had heard it before. "Please. Stay if you like." She hesitated only briefly before stepping further into the room, settling into the chair across from him, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire but far enough to maintain the careful distance she had come to rely on. For a long while neither of them spoke, the silence between them oddly comfortable rather than strained. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" Lily said eventually, her voice soft in the quiet room. "You may." "Why did you choose me?" she asked, watching his face carefully for any sign of the anger that had first brought him to her family's door. "Of everyone in that room, why me?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back toward the fire as though searching for an answer within the flames. "I am not entirely certain," he admitted finally, his voice low. I intended to take the daughter your father valued most. I intended to hurt him the way he hurt my family. But when I looked at you, standing apart from everyone else in that room, something told me you were the one who mattered." Lily's breath caught slightly, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "You knew nothing about me," she said. "How could you have known anything mattered at all?" "I didn't know," Alaric admitted. "I still don't, but I intend to find out." The words settled over her like a quiet warning, and Lily pulled her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of every inch of skin it concealed. She did not respond. She simply nodded once, rose from her chair, and excused herself for the night, leaving Alaric alone once more beside the dying fire, watching her go with an expression he could not quite name himself. Autumn settled over Thorn Manor slowly, painting the surrounding hills in shades of amber and rust, and with it came a change in the rhythm of the household that Lily had not anticipated. The days grew shorter, the evenings cooler, and Alaric began appearing at dinner more often than his study allowed, offering brief but increasingly genuine conversation over meals that had once passed in near silence. Lily told herself this meant nothing. She reminded herself, each night before sleep, that kindness offered freely was often the most dangerous kind, the sort that lulled a person into lowering guards they had spent years carefully building. And yet, despite every warning she gave herself, she found she looked forward to those dinners more than she cared to admit. One afternoon, while wandering the eastern garden in search of quiet, Lily lost her footing on a loose stone hidden beneath fallen leaves. Her ankle twisted sharply beneath her, and before she could catch herself, the world tilted and she felt her body pitching forward toward the hard earth. A sudden, firm grip caught her arm, steadying her just before she fell, and she looked up to find Alaric standing beside her, his expression tight with concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice sharper than she had heard it before, edged with something that sounded almost like fear. "I'm fine," Lily said quickly, though the throbbing pain in her ankle suggested otherwise. She attempted to take a step and immediately winced, her breath catching sharply. Without hesitation, Alaric bent and lifted her carefully into his arms, ignoring her soft protest as he carried her toward the manor. She stiffened instinctively at the closeness, her body tensing beneath his hold, though she said nothing, too proud to admit how unsettling and how strangely comforting the warmth of another person's arms felt after so many years of careful isolation. As he shifted her weight to open a door, his hand brushed briefly against her wrist where her sleeve had ridden up slightly during the fall. For the barest instant, his fingers grazed against something raised and uneven beneath her skin, thin lines, old and pale, but unmistakably deliberate. Lily froze, her entire body going rigid, and quickly pulled her sleeve back down, turning her face away so he could not see the sudden panic flooding her expression. Alaric said nothing in that moment. He simply continued walking, setting her carefully onto a chaise near the drawing-room fireplace and calling for a servant to fetch cold cloths and bandages for her ankle. But something in his eyes had changed, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps confusion, that lingered even as he stepped back to allow the household staff to attend to her injury. That night, Lily sat alone in her room long after the manor had gone quiet, her sleeve pushed up just enough to reveal the faint, familiar lines along her wrist. She traced them gently with her fingertips, memories rising unbidden, memories of cold nights, of harsh words, of a childhood spent believing she deserved every bit of suffering that came her way. She had spent years perfecting the art of hiding these marks, layering fabric and careful posture until even the sharpest eyes overlooked them entirely. But Alaric's touch, however brief, had been enough to threaten years of careful concealment. She did not sleep well that night, haunted by the fear that her carefully guarded secret might finally be unraveling. The following morning, Lily descended for breakfast with dread sitting heavy in her chest, certain Alaric would demand answers, or worse, look at her with the same pity she had endured from her family for years. Instead, she found him seated at the table as usual, newspaper in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "Your ankle," he said without looking up. "How does it feel this morning?" "Better," Lily said cautiously, settling into her seat. Thank you for your assistance yesterday." "It was nothing," Alaric replied, finally lowering his paper. His eyes studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing behind them, though he did not press further. "You should be more careful in the garden. The stones near the fountain have always been unstable." Relief flooded through her, quiet and immediate, though beneath it lingered a strange disappointment she could not quite explain. Perhaps she had expected questions. Perhaps some small, foolish part of her had wanted him to ask, to give her the chance to explain, even though she knew she never would have found the courage to answer honestly. Days passed, and Alaric said nothing more of what he had felt beneath her sleeve. But Lily noticed subtle changes in his behavior toward her. A new carefulness in the way he offered his arm when they walked together through the halls. A quiet attentiveness whenever she winced or grew pale, as though he were watching for something he had not previously understood he needed to watch for. One evening, as autumn rain fell heavily against the windows of the library, Lily found herself once again seated across from Alaric near the fire, a book resting unread in her lap. The storm outside seemed to loosen something between them, the sound of rain creating a private, insulated world where careful walls felt slightly less necessary. "May I ask you something, Miss Ashworth?" Alaric said quietly, his gaze fixed on the flames rather than on her. Lily's chest tightened, though she kept her voice steady. "You may ask. I cannot promise I will answer." "Your family," he said carefully, choosing his words with unusual hesitation. "They spoke of your health as though it were simply the way you were made, weak, sickly. But I have watched you these past weeks, and I do not see weakness, Miss Ashworth. I see someone who has learned to hide a great deal of pain very well." Lily's hands tightened around the edges of her book, her knuckles whitening slightly. "You are mistaken," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "Am I?" Alaric asked, finally turning to look at her directly. "The night I found you in that room, surrounded by your family, you did not look at me with fear. You looked at me the way someone looks at a punishment they believe they have already earned. I have thought of that expression every day since, and I cannot make sense of it." Lily rose abruptly, setting the book aside with trembling hands. "Your Grace, I appreciate your concern, but there are matters I do not wish to discuss. Not with you, not with anyone." "I am not asking you to discuss anything you are not ready to share," Alaric said gently, rising as well, though he made no move to stop her from leaving. "I am simply telling you that whatever you carry, whatever weight you have learned to hide beneath long sleeves and quiet composure, you need not fear my judgment. I brought you here intending to hurt your family through you. I did not expect to find someone already carrying more pain than I could ever inflict." Lily froze near the door, her back to him, her shoulders rigid with tension. For a long moment she said nothing, the only sound in the room the steady crackle of the fire and the rain against the windows. "You know nothing about me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell me," Alaric said softly. "Not tonight if you are not ready, but someday. I find that I want to know, Miss Ashworth, not as an instrument of my revenge, as myself." Lily did not respond. She simply left the room, her footsteps quick and unsteady as she made her way up the staircase toward the safety of her chamber, where she closed the door firmly and pressed her back against it, breathing hard, her heart pounding with an emotion she could not name. Over the following weeks, something shifted subtly between them, though neither acknowledged it directly. Alaric no longer pressed her with questions, but his attentiveness grew more pronounced, more careful, as though he were determined to prove through patience what he could not demand through words. He began accompanying her on her walks through the garden, adjusting his pace to match her slower steps without ever commenting on it. He ensured the household staff never rushed her, never questioned her need for rest, never made her feel, even for a moment, like a burden. Lily found herself softening despite every warning she gave herself. She began to look forward to their quiet evenings in the library, the comfortable silences that no longer felt like walls but like shared space. She caught herself smiling more often, laughing softly at his dry, unexpected humor, forgetting, for brief stretches of time, the reason she had come to Thorn Manor in the first place. But old habits did not disappear easily, and one evening, While helping Mrs. Whitfield sort through linens in preparation for the coming winter, Lily reached for a folded blanket on a high shelf, causing her sleeve to slip further up her arm than she intended. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes caught the movement, and for a brief, unguarded moment, her expression shifted, not with judgment, but with a quiet, painful understanding that told Lily the older woman had seen more than she meant to reveal. Neither of them spoke of it. Mrs. Whitfield simply reached over and gently adjusted the fabric back into place, her touch surprisingly tender, before continuing their work as though nothing had happened at all. But later that evening, as Lily prepared for bed, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Whitfield standing in the hallway, a small cup of warm tea in her hands. "I thought you might have trouble sleeping tonight," Mrs. Whitfield said simply, offering the cup. Lily accepted it slowly, uncertain what to say. "Thank you," she managed finally. Mrs. Whitfield hesitated at the doorway, her expression softening in a way Lily had not seen before. "I raised 3 daughters of my own, Miss Ashworth," she said quietly. "I know what it looks like when someone has spent years learning to survive things no one should have to survive alone. Whatever weight you carry, you need not carry it entirely by yourself within these walls. That is all I wish to say." Before Lily could respond, Mrs. Whitfield turned and disappeared down the corridor, leaving Lily standing alone in her doorway, tea cooling slightly in her trembling hands, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes for reasons she could not fully explain even to herself. That night, for the first time since arriving at Thorn Manor, Lily allowed herself to cry, quietly, carefully, the way she had trained herself to grieve since childhood, without sound, without witnesses, releasing years of buried pain into the safety of an empty room. When the tears finally stopped, she felt lighter than she had in longer than she could remember, though the wooden box in her bottom drawer remained exactly where she had left it, still unopened, still holding secrets she was not yet ready to release into the light. Outside her window, the rain continued to fall, steady and unhurried, as though the world itself understood that healing, like storms, could not be rushed, only endured, one quiet moment at a time. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the hills around Thorn Manor in thick layers of frost, and with the changing season came a letter that Alaric had not expected. It arrived by private courier one gray morning, sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar crest, and he read its contents alone in his study, his expression darkening with every line. The letter came from a physician in the northern county, a man Alaric's late mother had trusted decades earlier, before illness had taken her from the family far too soon. The physician wrote requesting confirmation of certain estate records, mentioning almost in passing a name that made Alaric's blood run cold: Ashworth. It seemed the physician had once been summoned to Ashworth Hall many years prior, called upon for a matter the family had insisted remained strictly private. Alaric set the letter down slowly, his mind racing. He knew he should let the matter rest, that whatever business the physician once conducted at Ashworth Hall was not his concern. But the memory of Lily's wrist beneath his fingers, the raised lines he had felt and never mentioned, gnawed at him with growing urgency. He found himself reaching for paper and ink before he had fully decided to do so, drafting a careful, discreet inquiry to the physician, requesting whatever information could be shared regarding the nature of that long-ago visit. The response arrived nearly 2 weeks later, and what it contained shattered whatever remained of Alaric's original intentions toward the Ashworth family. The physician's letter was careful, clearly written by a man wrestling with his own conscience even as he set the words to paper. He explained that he had been summoned to Ashworth Hall following what the family had described only as an incident involving their youngest daughter, then barely more than a child. He had been instructed, in no uncertain terms, to treat her injuries quietly and to record nothing in his official documentation. He had complied at the time, young and eager to maintain his standing among the county's noble families, though he confessed the memory had troubled him in the years since. The physician went on to describe injuries that made Alaric's stomach turn, not accidental wounds, not the marks of illness or misfortune, but signs of deliberate, sustained harm inflicted over what appeared to be a significant period. He wrote of bruises in various stages of healing, of a young girl who flinched violently at unexpected touch, of a household staff too frightened of their employer to speak freely about what they witnessed within those walls. The physician's letter ended with a single line that Alaric read over and over until the words blurred before his eyes. "I have carried the guilt of my silence for many years, Your Grace, and I pray that wherever that young woman is now, she has finally found somewhere safe." Alaric sat motionless in his study for a long while after finishing the letter, the fire beside him burning low, his mind replaying every interaction he had shared with Lily since her arrival, her careful composure, her guarded silences, the way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone moved too quickly near her. He had mistaken her steadiness for resilience born of simple hardship. He had never imagined the truth ran this deep, this deliberate, this cruel. He thought of the family he had encountered that first evening at Ashworth Hall, Edmund's nervous laughter, Charlotte's practiced composure, Margaret's tearful guilt. He thought of how easily they had allowed him to take Lily away, how little protest they had truly offered once the initial shock passed. He had assumed their silence meant indifference. Now he understood it meant something far darker, relief, perhaps, that the daughter they had spent years harming was finally someone else's burden to bear. Rage built slowly within him, colder and more focused than the anger that had originally driven him to Ashworth Hall seeking revenge. That earlier anger had been about pride, about old debts and old wounds between two noble families. This anger was different. This anger was personal in a way he had not anticipated, rooted not in his own family's history but in hers. He found himself rising from his desk and moving toward the door before he had fully decided what he intended to do, driven by an urgent need to see her, to understand, to somehow undo the damage he had unknowingly deepened by bringing her into his home as an instrument of revenge, rather than recognizing her as someone who desperately needed protection. He found Lily in the library, as he often did in the late afternoon hours, seated near the window with a book open in her lap, though her eyes were fixed on the frost-covered garden beyond the glass rather than the pages before her. She looked up as he entered, something in his expression immediately putting her on guard. "Your Grace," she said carefully, closing her book. "You look troubled." Alaric hesitated at the doorway, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. He had rushed here without a plan, driven by emotion rather than careful thought, and now, faced with her calm, guarded expression, he found himself unable to simply announce what he had learned. "May I sit with you?" he asked instead, his voice softer than usual. Lily nodded slowly, watching him with growing wariness as he settled into the chair across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound in the room the soft crackle of the fire and the distant howl of winter wind against the windows. "I received a letter today," Alaric said finally, choosing his words with great care. "From a physician who once visited Ashworth Hall, many years ago." Lily's entire body went rigid, the color draining slowly from her face. She said nothing, but her hands, resting in her lap, curled tightly into the fabric of her skirt. "I did not seek this information to invade your privacy," Alaric continued gently, watching her carefully for any sign that he should stop. "I sought it because I could not stop thinking about what I felt beneath your sleeve that day in the garden, and because your composure, your steadiness in the face of things that should have frightened you terribly, told me there was a story beneath the surface that no one had ever allowed you to tell." Tears gathered suddenly in Lily's eyes, though she fought to hold them back, her jaw tightening with the effort. "What did he tell you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Enough," Alaric said quietly. "Enough to understand that the family I sought to punish had already spent years hurting you far more deeply than I ever could have. Enough to understand that, when you told me punishment did not frighten you, it was because you had already survived far worse than anything I intended to deliver." A single tear escaped down Lily's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the display of emotion she had spent years learning to suppress. "It does not matter now," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound composed. "It happened. It is over. I have learned to live with it." "It should matter," Alaric said, leaning forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. It should have mattered to everyone who was supposed to protect you. Your father, your sisters, the household staff who witnessed what was happening and said nothing. It should have mattered long before a stranger with his own selfish reasons for revenge showed up at your door and demanded you as payment for a debt that was never yours to settle. Lily looked up at him then, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp with something fierce and unguarded. "Why does it matter to you now?" she asked. "You came to that house seeking to hurt my family. You chose me because you thought I was the weakest, the easiest target for your revenge. What changed, Your Grace? What makes my pain suddenly worthy of your concern?" Alaric absorbed her words without flinching, understanding the fairness of her anger even as it cut through him. "You are right to question my intentions," he admitted. "I came to that house blind with my own anger, so consumed by my family's old wounds that I saw your family only as instruments of revenge, without ever considering the individual lives within those walls. I was wrong to choose you the way I did, for the reasons I did. But I am not wrong now, Miss Ashworth, when I tell you that what I feel toward you has nothing to do with revenge any longer." "Then what is it?" Lily asked, her voice breaking slightly despite her effort to remain composed. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, searching for words honest enough to match the weight of her question. "I do not fully know," he admitted finally, "but I know that the thought of what was done to you fills me with an anger I have not felt since the day I learned of my own family's betrayal. I know that watching you these past weeks, learning slowly to trust the quiet safety of this house, has become more important to me than any revenge I once sought against your father. And I know that whatever happens next, I do not intend to be another person in your life who causes you harm, even unintentionally." Lily studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the deception she had learned to expect from those who claimed to care for her. But she found none. Only quiet, steady sincerity, and something else beneath it, something that looked almost like fear, as though he was as unsettled by his own feelings as she was by hers. "I do not know how to trust kindness, Your Grace," she admitted finally, her voice small and honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "I have been offered gentleness before, only to have it used against me later. I do not know how to believe this is different." "Then do not believe it yet," Alaric said softly. "Simply allow me the chance to prove it, one day at a time, for as long as it takes." Lily said nothing further, but she did not pull away when he reached across the small distance between them and gently took her hand in his own, careful and light, as though holding something precious enough to break. For the first time since her arrival at Thorn Manor, she allowed herself to sit in that fragile, uncertain space between fear and hope, uncertain of what waited on the other side, but no longer entirely alone in carrying the weight of what had brought her there. In the days that followed, Alaric found himself unable to settle back into the quiet routines of estate management that had once occupied his every waking hour. The letter from the physician remained locked in his desk drawer, but its contents lived constantly in his mind, resurfacing at unexpected moments, during meetings with his steward, during quiet dinners with Lily, during the long, sleepless hours of night when the manor grew still and his thoughts grew loud. He began to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that his original plan for revenge had been built on a foundation he no longer recognized as just. He had wanted Edmund Ashworth to suffer, to lose something precious the way Alaric's own family had lost so much years ago when Edmund's schemes had cost them their fortune, and indirectly, his mother's health and eventual death. But the daughter Edmund had so readily surrendered was not precious to him at all. She had been discarded, quietly and cruelly, long before Alaric ever arrived at their door demanding payment for old debts. The realization sat heavy in his chest, curdling into something between guilt and fury. He had believed himself an instrument of justice, delivering consequence to a man who deserved it. Instead, he had unknowingly become the final link in a long chain of people who had used Lily Ashworth for their own purposes without ever considering what she needed, what she deserved, what she had already survived. He summoned his steward one gray morning and requested a full accounting of the Ashworth family's finances, and standing within the county, along with any records of complaints, rumors, or concerns that had ever circulated regarding the household. His steward returned within days with a modest collection of documents, along with a piece of information that confirmed what Alaric had already begun to suspect. The physician who had written to him was not the only one who had once been summoned to Ashworth Hall under similarly quiet, similarly troubling circumstances. There had been a governess, dismissed abruptly years earlier after raising concerns with a local magistrate that were never formally investigated. There had been a housemaid who left her position without notice, later found working in a distant county, unwilling to speak of her time at Ashworth Hall to anyone who asked. Small threads, easily dismissed individually, but woven together, they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. Alaric brought the information to Lily one evening, not to burden her further, but because he believed she deserved to know the full truth of what he had uncovered, rather than allowing her to wonder what secrets he might be keeping from her the way so many others had kept secrets about her own life. They sat together in the library, the fire burning low, snow falling steadily beyond the frosted windows. Lily listened in silence as he explained what his steward had discovered, her expression carefully composed, though her hands remained tightly clasped in her lap throughout his explanation. "You did not need to look into any of this," she said quietly when he finished. "It changes nothing about what already happened." "Perhaps not for you," Alaric said gently, "but it changes what I intend to do next." Lily looked up at him, wariness flickering across her features. "What do you mean?" "I mean that a man who spent years harming his own daughter, who allowed his household staff to witness and remain silent about that harm, does not deserve to continue holding his position in society unchallenged," Alaric said, his voice firm with quiet resolve. "I came to Ashworth Hall seeking to damage your father's reputation as revenge for what he did to my family. I now intend to expose the truth of what he did to you, not as revenge, but as justice long overdue." Fear flashed across Lily's face, sharp and immediate. "No," she said quickly, rising from her chair. "You cannot do that." "Lily, you do not understand what you are proposing," she said, her voice rising with an urgency he had not heard from her before. "If this becomes public, if society learns the truth of what happened in that house, it will not simply damage my father's reputation. It will damage mine as well. People will not see a victim, your grace. They will see damaged goods, a woman too broken to be considered respectable, someone to be pitied at best and shunned at worst. I have spent years hiding this precisely to avoid that fate. Please, do not undo that protection now, however well-intentioned your reasons." Alaric rose as well, moving toward her slowly, careful not to crowd her, though every instinct urged him to close the distance between them. "I hear you," he said softly, "and I will not act against your wishes. But I need you to understand something, Lily. You are not damaged goods. You are not something to be pitied or hidden away. What was done to you was a crime, committed by people who should have protected you, and the shame of that crime belongs entirely to them, not to you." Lily's eyes filled with tears she fought valiantly to hold back. "It does not feel that way," she whispered. "It has never felt that way." "I know," Alaric said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "But it is true nonetheless, whether or not you feel it yet." They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything unspoken settling heavily between them. Finally, Lily wiped her eyes and drew a steadying breath, her composure returning slowly, piece by careful piece. "What do you intend to do, then?" she asked, "if not expose the truth publicly?" Alaric considered the question carefully before answering. "I intend to ensure your father understands, privately and unmistakably, that his actions are known and will not be forgotten. I intend to see that any future harm he might consider inflicting on your sisters is made impossible through consequences he cannot ignore. And I intend to make certain that you, Lily Ashworth, never again have to depend on that family for anything. Not your safety, not your reputation, not your future." "How do you propose to do that?" Lily asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. Alaric hesitated only briefly before speaking, choosing his next words with the careful weight of a man who understood their permanence. "By offering you a place here that is not temporary, not conditional on old debts or borrowed revenge. By offering you a future entirely separate from the family that failed you, built instead on whatever you choose to make of it, with my support, for as long as you wish to have it." Lily stared at him, understanding slowly dawning in her eyes. "Your Grace, are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting that I no longer see you as an instrument of revenge against your father," Alaric said quietly. "I see you as someone I wish to protect, to support, and if you will allow it in time, to know more fully than I currently do. I am not asking for anything from you tonight. I am simply telling you what I intend, so that you understand your future here is not dependent on my original, foolish reasons for bringing you to this house." Lily said nothing for a long moment, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, the steadiness of his gaze, the sheer unfamiliarity of being offered protection without conditions attached. She had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of genuine care that she did not fully know how to accept it, even now, even from a man who had proven, day after day, that his intentions had changed. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Take whatever time you need," Alaric said gently. "I am not going anywhere." In the weeks that followed, word of Alaric's private investigation into Edmund Ashworth's affairs began to circulate quietly through certain channels, carefully controlled to avoid public scandal, while still ensuring Edmund understood the precariousness of his position. Alaric arranged, through careful legal maneuvering, to secure Margaret's future independently of her father's control, ensuring she would never be vulnerable to the same neglect and cruelty her younger sister had endured. He made certain, through discreet correspondence with trusted associates, that Edmund understood any further harm inflicted upon his remaining daughters would result in consequences far more severe than a quiet letter from a troubled physician. Edmund, for his part, responded exactly as Alaric expected, with panicked, careful compliance, terrified of losing what remained of his social standing. He sent no further communication regarding Lily, made no attempt to reclaim her or interfere with her new life at Thorn Manor. The silence, though expected, still left a complicated mixture of relief and quiet grief in Lily's chest, relief that her father's neglect had finally been transformed into consequence, grief for a family that had never truly been a family at all. Margaret wrote to her occasionally, careful letters filled with quiet apology and cautious hope for a relationship they might slowly rebuild, separate from the shadow of their father's failures. Charlotte's letters, when they came, remained distant and formal, though even she eventually softened enough to express, in careful, guarded words, something resembling regret for her own silence during the years Lily had suffered. Lily read each letter carefully, allowing herself neither to fully forgive nor fully condemn the family that had shaped so much of her pain. She simply allowed herself, for the first time, the freedom to decide what role, if any, they would play in whatever future she chose to build. And as winter deepened around Thorn Manor, that future began, slowly and carefully, to take shape, not through grand declarations or sudden transformations, but through small, steady moments of trust rebuilding itself one day at a time, between a woman who had spent her life hiding her pain and a man who had once sought revenge, but found, instead, something far more valuable in its place. Despite the quiet progress that had grown between them, Lily found herself retreating in the weeks that followed Alaric's declaration in the library. She told herself it was caution, simple and reasonable caution born from years of learning that trust offered too quickly often led to deeper wounds than distrust ever could. But beneath that reasoning lived something rawer, something she rarely allowed herself to examine too closely, a fear that if she opened herself fully to the warmth Alaric offered, she would eventually be punished for daring to want it. She began avoiding their evening conversations in the library, retreating instead to her room earlier each night, offering polite but brief responses during their shared breakfasts. Alaric noticed the shift immediately, though he said nothing at first, giving her the space she seemed to need, even as concern grew steadily behind his careful patience. It was Mrs. Whitfield who eventually addressed the growing distance directly, finding Lily alone in the garden one crisp morning, wrapped tightly in her shawl despite the layers already covering her arms. "You've been avoiding him," Mrs. Whitfield said simply, settling onto the bench beside her without invitation. Lily did not deny it. "It is safer this way," she said quietly. "Safer for whom?" Mrs. Whitfield asked, her tone gentle but pointed. "I have watched His Grace these past months, Miss Ashworth. I have served this family since before he was born, and I have never seen him as careful, as patient, or as genuinely concerned for another person's well-being as he has been with you. Whatever fear keeps you retreating from him, I do not believe it is protecting you from anything except the chance at real happiness." "You do not understand," Lily said, her voice tightening. "Kindness has been offered to me before. It never lasted. It always came with conditions I could not meet, or it disappeared the moment I needed it most. I cannot bear to build something with him only to watch it collapse the way everything else in my life has collapsed." Mrs. Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression full of quiet understanding rather than judgment. "Then perhaps," she said finally, "it is time you told him exactly why you fear that collapse, rather than allowing him to guess at shadows he cannot fully see." That evening, driven by Mrs. Whitfield's words, and a courage she was not entirely certain she possessed, Lily sought Alaric out in his study rather than waiting for him to find her. He looked up from his desk in surprise as she entered, quickly rising to offer her a seat, concern immediately etched across his features at the unusual determination in her expression. "Lily, is something wrong?" "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain composed. "And I need you to listen without interrupting, because if you interrupt, I do not think I will find the courage to finish." Alaric nodded slowly, settling back into his chair, giving her his full, undivided attention. Lily drew a steadying breath and began, her voice quiet at first, then gradually growing stronger as the words she had held inside for so long finally found release. She spoke of her childhood, of a mother lost too young, of a father who had never forgiven her for surviving a birth that had cost him the wife he claimed to love. She spoke of years spent being blamed for a tragedy she had no control over, of punishment disguised as discipline, of a household that had slowly, systematically taught her that her presence was tolerated only when it caused no inconvenience, and punished severely whenever it did. She spoke, haltingly, of the marks along her arms and collarbone, though she did not go into painful detail, offering only enough truth to make the shape of her suffering clear without forcing herself to relive every specific moment aloud. She spoke of the wooden box hidden in her bottom drawer, containing letters her mother had written before her death, letters Lily had never found the courage to fully read, because doing so meant confronting grief she had never been allowed to properly feel. "I do not tell you this for pity," Lily said finally, her eyes finding his despite the vulnerability trembling through every word. "I tell you because you deserve to understand exactly what you would be choosing if you truly intend to build something with me. I am not simply frail or quiet or difficult to know. I am someone who has spent her entire life believing she does not deserve good things, and I do not know how to unlearn that belief, no matter how much kindness you offer me." Alaric was silent for a long moment after she finished, his jaw tight with barely controlled emotion, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as though physically restraining himself from some larger reaction. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, though clearly strained with the effort of remaining calm. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me with that." Lily blinked, surprised by the simplicity of his response after the weight of what she had shared. "That is all you have to say?" "No," Alaric said, rising slowly and moving around the desk to kneel before her chair, bringing himself level with her rather than looming over her from a position of power. "That is simply where I choose to begin. Lily, what was done to you was cruel and unjust, and nothing about it reflects any failing on your part. You did not deserve punishment for surviving. You did not deserve to be taught that your presence required apology. Every belief you carry about not deserving good things is a lie your family planted in you through years of deliberate cruelty, and I intend to spend as long as it takes helping you unlearn it, if you will allow me the chance." Tears finally broke free, sliding down Lily's cheeks as years of carefully suppressed grief found release in the safety of his steady, unwavering presence. Alaric did not reach for her immediately, understanding instinctively that she needed the choice to close whatever distance remained between them. He simply waited, patient and present, until Lily herself leaned forward and allowed him to gather her gently into his arms. They remained like that for a long while, Lily's tears soaking quietly into his shoulder as he held her with careful, steady tenderness, murmuring soft reassurances that asked nothing of her in return. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back slightly, wiping her face with trembling hands, feeling simultaneously exhausted and strangely lighter than she had felt in years. "I am frightened," she admitted quietly, "of wanting this, of wanting you." "I am frightened too," Alaric admitted, surprising her with his honesty. "Frightened of failing you the way everyone else in your life has failed you. Frightened of not being patient enough, careful enough, worthy of the trust you are only beginning to offer me. But I would rather face that fear alongside you than watch you continue carrying this weight entirely alone." Lily managed a small, watery smile, the first genuine smile Alaric had seen from her in weeks. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we can be frightened together then." "I believe," Alaric said, gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek, "that sounds like an excellent place to begin." In the days that followed their conversation, something between them shifted permanently. The careful distance Lily had maintained slowly dissolving into genuine, comfortable closeness. She began joining him again for evening conversations in the library, though now their discussions ventured into deeper territory, each of them sharing pieces of themselves they had long kept hidden from the world. Alaric spoke, for the first time, of his own mother's decline following his family's financial ruin, of the guilt he carried for not protecting her, of the anger that had driven him toward revenge in the first place before Lily's presence in his life had shown him a different path entirely. One evening, several weeks later, Lily finally found the courage to open the wooden box she had carried with her from Ashworth Hall, sitting alone in her room with trembling hands as she lifted the lid for the first time in over a year. Inside lay a small collection of letters, written in her mother's careful, elegant handwriting, dated from the final months before her death, each one addressed simply to "My darling Lily, whom I already love beyond measure." Lily read each letter slowly, tears streaming freely down her face as she absorbed words of love and hope her mother had written for a daughter she would never live to see grow up. Words entirely absent of blame, filled instead with dreams for Lily's future, with gentle wishes for happiness and strength, with a mother's fierce, unconditional love that had somehow survived, preserved on paper, through all the years of cruelty that followed. When she finished reading, Lily sat quietly for a long while, the letters spread carefully across her lap, understanding slowly settling over her like a long-awaited dawn. Her mother had never blamed her for anything. That blame had been manufactured entirely by her father, weaponized against a grieving, motherless child who had never deserved a single moment of the suffering inflicted upon her. She carried the letters downstairs that evening, finding Alaric in his study, and without a word she handed them to him, allowing him to read the proof of a love she had spent years believing she never possessed. He read them carefully, his expression growing more emotional with each page, and when he finished, he looked up at her with an intensity that stole the breath from her chest. "She loved you completely," he said softly, "exactly as you deserve to be loved." "I know," Lily said, her voice steady with a newfound certainty that had been building slowly within her for weeks. "I finally know." And as the letters settled safely between them, a quiet, unspoken understanding passed through the room. The understanding that whatever pain had shaped Lily's past no longer held the same power over her future, not while she stood surrounded by proof of love that had always been real, and by the steady, growing presence of a man who had learned to cherish her not despite her scars, but because of the extraordinary strength it had taken to survive them. News of Edmund Ashworth's quiet unraveling reached Thorne Manor gradually, carried through letters from Margaret and whispered conversations among household staff who maintained connections across the county. Without the fear of exposure hanging directly over him, Edmund had grown careless, his financial mismanagement finally catching up with years of reckless decisions he had made, believing his reputation would always shield him from consequence. Alaric received word one morning that Edmund had defaulted on several significant debts, the same kind of financial ruin that had once devastated the Thorne family years earlier. For a moment, old satisfaction flickered through him, a brief, instinctive pull toward the revenge he had originally sought. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by something steadier and more important: concern for how this development might affect Lily and her sisters. He brought the news to Lily that evening, watching her carefully for her reaction as he explained what he had learned. "Margaret's independence should protect her from the worst of it," Lily said thoughtfully, processing the information with far more composure than Alaric had expected. "You made certain of that already. Charlotte, I imagine, will find a way to secure her own future through marriage, as she always intended." "And your father?" Alaric asked carefully. Lily was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I find that I do not feel the satisfaction I once imagined I might feel, hearing that he is finally facing consequences for his choices," she said slowly. "I simply feel tired of a family that caused so much pain, tired of carrying anger toward people who will likely never understand the depth of what they did to me." "You are allowed to feel whatever you feel," Alaric said gently. "There is no correct way to respond to a father's failures." "I know," Lily said, offering him a small, grateful smile. "That is precisely why I feel safe enough to say it aloud." In the weeks that followed, Alaric made a decision he had been quietly considering for some time. Rather than allowing Edmund's downfall to unfold through impersonal financial ruin alone, he arranged a private meeting between himself and Lily's father, determined to deliver, face to face, the reckoning he believed necessary, not for revenge, but for accountability long overdue. He did not tell Lily of his plan beforehand, unwilling to burden her with anticipation of a confrontation she had no obligation to witness or endure. He traveled to Ashworth Hall alone on a cold winter morning, finding the once grand estate noticeably diminished, several rooms closed off entirely, the staff reduced to a fraction of what it had once been. Edmund received him in a study far less impressive than Alaric remembered, his composure visibly strained beneath a thin veneer of forced dignity. "Your Grace," Edmund said, rising stiffly from his chair, "I confess I did not expect a visit." "I imagine there is a great deal you did not expect, Lord Ashworth," Alaric said coldly, remaining standing rather than accepting the seat Edmund gestured toward. "Including, perhaps, the consequences of your own actions finally arriving at your door." Edmund's jaw tightened, though he said nothing, clearly aware of the precariousness of his position. "I know what you did to your youngest daughter," Alaric continued, his voice hard and unwavering. "I know of the physician you silenced, the household staff who witnessed your cruelty and were too frightened to speak against you. I know that the years of pain Lily carries were not accidents of frail health, but the direct result of your choices." "Whatever you believe you know," Edmund began, his voice tight with barely restrained panic, "you must understand that grief affects men in unpredictable ways. The loss of my wife—" "Do not," Alaric interrupted sharply, "attempt to excuse years of deliberate cruelty by invoking a grief that gave you no right to punish an innocent child for surviving her own birth." Edmund fell silent, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "I did not come here today for revenge," Alaric continued, his voice calmer now, though no less firm. "I came to tell you plainly that whatever remains of your reputation, whatever financial ruin now threatens your household, is a consequence entirely of your own making, unrelated to any action I have taken against you. I have chosen not to expose the full truth of what you did to Lily publicly, out of respect for her wishes, not out of mercy toward you. But you should understand clearly, Lord Ashworth, that I am watching. If I learn that you have caused further harm to Margaret, to Charlotte, or attempted to reestablish any claim over Lily's life, I will not extend that same restraint a second time." Edmund said nothing, his silence a clear, if reluctant, acknowledgment of the warning delivered. "One final matter," Alaric said, turning toward the door before pausing to deliver his last words. "Lily read her mother's letters. She knows now that whatever blame you placed upon her for her mother's death was never justified, was never anything but your own grief twisted into cruelty against a defenseless child. I do not know if you are capable of understanding the damage you caused, Lord Ashworth, but I want you to know that despite everything, your daughter has found happiness beyond these walls. She has found people who value her precisely as she is. That happiness exists entirely without you, and it will continue to grow regardless of whatever consequences now arrive at your door." He left Ashworth Hall without waiting for a response, feeling, for the first time since his original visit months earlier, a genuine sense of resolution rather than the hollow satisfaction he had once believed revenge would provide. When he returned to Thorn Manor that evening, he found Lily waiting for him in the entrance hall, having somehow learned of his journey despite his effort to keep it private. Mrs. Whitfield, he suspected, had been unable to keep the secret entirely to herself. "You want to see him," Lily said, her expression difficult to read as she studied his face for answers. "I did," Alaric admitted, removing his coat and setting it aside. "I should have told you beforehand. I apologize for that." "What did you say to him?" Lily asked, moving closer, her voice steady despite the vulnerability visible in her eyes. Alaric recounted the conversation carefully, watching her reaction closely as he spoke, ready to offer comfort should the memory of her father prove too painful to bear. But as he finished, he found Lily's expression settling into something unexpected, quiet relief, mixed with a strength that had grown steadily within her over the preceding months. "Thank you," she said softly, "not for confronting him on my behalf, though I am grateful for that as well. Thank you for understanding that I needed the choice of whether to face him myself, and for respecting that choice even when it meant handling this difficult matter without my knowledge." "I wanted to protect you," Alaric admitted, "though I understand now that protection sometimes means allowing someone the space to heal in their own way, at their own pace, without shielding them entirely from difficult truths." Lily reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his with a confidence that would have seemed impossible for her only months earlier. "You have given me more than protection these past months, Alaric," she said quietly, using his given name for the first time since her arrival. "You have given me the space to become someone I did not believe I was capable of becoming, someone strong enough to face her past without being destroyed by it." Alaric brought her hand gently to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "You were always that strong, Lily," he said softly. "I simply had the privilege of watching you discover it for yourself." That night, as snow continued falling steadily outside the windows of Thorn Manor, Lily found herself standing before the mirror in her room, studying her own reflection with an honesty she had avoided for years. She reached up slowly and unfastened the top buttons of her collar, allowing the fabric to fall open just slightly, revealing the faint scars along her collarbone that she had spent so long hiding from the world. She did not flinch from the sight the way she once had. She simply studied the marks with quiet acceptance, understanding finally that they represented not weakness or shame, but survival, proof of everything she had endured and everything she had overcome to arrive at this moment, in this house, with a man who had taught her, through patient and unwavering devotion, that she was worthy of love exactly as she was, scars and all. Downstairs, Alaric sat alone in his study, staring at the wooden box he had asked Lily's permission to keep safe in his own possession, a quiet symbol of the trust that had grown steadily between them since that first difficult confrontation in the library. He thought of the man he had been the night he arrived at Ashworth Hall, consumed by anger and a desperate need for revenge that he now understood had never truly been about justice at all. That man felt like a stranger to him now, replaced by someone who understood, finally, that true strength lay not in punishing others for old wounds, but in choosing, deliberately and consistently, to become someone worthy of the trust and love that had somehow found its way into his life despite every mistake he had made along the way. Spring arrived at Thorn Manor with a gentleness that felt almost symbolic, melting away the last remnants of a winter that had carried both hardship and healing in equal measure. The garden's lily had once wandered alone in careful solitude, now bloomed vibrant and alive, and she found herself spending long afternoons among the flowers, no longer hiding from the world but genuinely, quietly enjoying her place within it. Word of the growing closeness between the Duke and Miss Ashworth had, inevitably, begun to circulate through certain social circles, carried by servants' whispers and the occasional careful observation from visiting acquaintances. Alaric made no effort to hide his devotion to her, nor did he offer explanations to anyone who might question the unconventional beginning of their relationship. He had learned, through months of watching Lily slowly reclaim her own worth, that other people's opinions mattered far less than the quiet, steady truth of what existed between them. One warm afternoon in early spring, Alaric found Lily in the garden, seated on a stone bench beneath a blossoming tree, her face tilted toward the sun with an ease that would have seemed impossible for her only months earlier. He approached slowly, watching her for a long moment before she noticed his presence. "You look happy," he said softly, settling beside her on the bench. "I am happy," Lily replied, turning to smile at him, genuine and unguarded. "I did not think I would ever be able to say that so simply." Alaric reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, his hand surprisingly unsteady for a man usually so composed. Lily's eyes widened as she recognized the significance of the gesture, her breath catching in her throat. "Lily," Alaric began, his voice carrying the same quiet sincerity that had slowly, patiently earned her trust over the preceding months. "I came to your family's home intending to take something as payment for an old debt, believing revenge would finally heal wounds that had festered within me for years. Instead, I found someone who taught me that true healing comes not from punishing others, but from choosing love, patience, and genuine devotion, even when it requires facing difficult truths about ourselves along the way." He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring that caught the afternoon light. "I do not offer this out of any remaining sense of debt or obligation," he continued. "I offer it because I have come to love you completely, not despite everything you have survived, but because of the extraordinary strength, grace, and resilience that survival has revealed within you. Lily Ashworth, will you allow me the honor of building a future with you, entirely separate from everything that once caused you pain?" Tears gathered in Lily's eyes, though this time they carried none of the old sorrow that had once accompanied her tears so frequently. She reached out and gently touched his face, marveling at how far they had both traveled from that cold, tense evening when he had first demanded her presence as an instrument of revenge. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady with a certainty that had grown slowly but unshakably within her. "Yes, Alaric, I will." Their wedding took place in early summer, a small, intimate ceremony held in the very garden where Lily had first begun to heal, surrounded by wildflowers she had once wandered among in solitary sadness. Margaret attended, her presence warm and genuinely joyful, the beginning of a relationship between the sisters that would continue growing stronger in the years that followed, no longer shadowed by the guilt and silence of their shared past. Even Charlotte attended, her composure softened by genuine, if still somewhat reserved, happiness for her sister's transformed circumstances. Edmund did not attend. No invitation had been extended, and none had been expected. Lily had made her peace, slowly and carefully, with the reality that some relationships could not be repaired, only released, allowing space for the ones that could genuinely flourish to take their place. Mrs. Whitfield stood proudly among the small gathering, tears of genuine happiness in her eyes as she watched the young woman she had come to care for deeply finally step into a life built on safety, respect, and unconditional love. As Lily and Alaric exchanged their vows beneath the blossoming trees, sunlight filtering warmly through the branches above them, Lily found herself thinking of her mother's letters, safely preserved now in a beautifully carved box that Alaric had commissioned specifically to honor their significance. She thought of the young girl who had once believed herself unworthy of love, who had spent years hiding beneath long sleeves and high collars, convinced that her scars made her undeserving of tenderness. That girl felt distant now, not forgotten, but transformed, her pain acknowledged and honored rather than hidden, her survival celebrated rather than shamed, her scars visible now beneath the elegant, open-necked gown she had chosen deliberately for her wedding day. A quiet, powerful declaration that she no longer needed to hide anything about who she was or what she had endured to become the woman standing before the man who loved her completely. As their ceremony concluded, and Alaric gently cupped her face in his hands before their first kiss as husband and wife, Lily felt something settle within her that she had never fully experienced before, a deep, unshakable sense of belonging, of safety, of being seen and loved exactly as she was, without condition, without shame, without the constant fear that this happiness might be suddenly, cruelly taken away. In the years that followed, Thorn Manor transformed slowly from the cold, severe fortress it had once been into a genuine home, filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet, steady presence of two people who had each, in their own way, learned that true strength came not from revenge or isolation, but from the courage to trust, to heal, and to love fully despite everything that had once taught them otherwise. Lily eventually opened her mother's letters again, this time sharing them with her own children as they grew older, teaching them the story of a grandmother's unconditional love that had somehow survived every attempt to erase it, and the story of a mother who had learned, against every obstacle placed before her, that she was always worthy of that same love herself. And though the scars along her collarbone and wrists never fully disappeared, Lily no longer felt the need to hide them. They remained, quiet and permanent, a testament not to weakness or shame, but to the extraordinary resilience of a woman who had survived what should have destroyed her, and who had found, finally, in the arms of a man who had once come seeking revenge, the safety, love, and belonging she had always deserved. Years later, long after the wedding flowers had faded into memory, the halls of Thorn Manor rang with sounds that had once been unimaginable within those cold stone walls. The laughter of children running along the corridors, the warmth of a household built not on fear or obligation, but on genuine affection between everyone who called it home. Lily often stood near the same library window where she had once sat in guarded silence, watching her children play in the garden below, marveling at how completely her life had transformed since the night a stranger's carriage had arrived at Ashworth Hall demanding revenge. Margaret visited often, her own life having steadily blossomed once free from their father's shadow. She had married a kind, unremarkable gentleman named Henry, a man of quiet warmth who adored her completely, and together they had built a modest, happy household not far from Thorn Manor. The sisters spent countless afternoons together, slowly repairing the bond that guilt and silence had once fractured, finding in each other a friendship neither had believed possible during their difficult childhood. Charlotte, too, eventually found her own path toward genuine happiness, marrying a respected gentleman she had grown to love rather than one chosen merely for social advantage. Though her relationship with Lily remained somewhat more reserved than the bond Lily shared with Margaret, genuine affection had grown between them over the years, built slowly through shared holidays, and the gradual softening that time and honest conversation eventually provided. Edmund lived out his remaining years in quiet, diminished circumstances, his once proud estate reduced significantly by his own mismanagement and the consequences of choices he had made decades earlier. He reached out only once more, several years after Lily's wedding, sending a brief, hesitant letter expressing what appeared to be genuine, if painfully delayed, remorse for the pain he had caused. Lily read the letter carefully, then folded it away without response, understanding finally that forgiveness, if it came at all, need not require reconciliation, and that her own peace no longer depended on anything her father might say or do. Mrs. Whitfield remained a beloved fixture within the household for many years, eventually stepping back from her formal duties, but never truly leaving the family she had grown to consider her own. She lived to see Lily's children grow into kind, confident young people, often remarking with quiet pride that she had never doubted, from that very first night, that Lily possessed a strength far greater than anyone had ever given her credit for. Alaric's devotion to Lily never wavered through the years that followed their wedding. He remained, always, the steady, patient presence that had first helped her believe herself worthy of genuine love, and their relationship continued deepening through every season of their shared life, built on a foundation of honesty, respect, and unwavering support that neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding when their story first began under such difficult, unlikely circumstances. On quiet evenings, long after their children had grown and built lives of their own, Lily and Alaric often sat together near the same library fireplace where their bond had first begun to deepen, reflecting on the long, difficult, ultimately beautiful journey that had brought them to this place of genuine peace and happiness. "Do you ever regret it?" Lily asked him once, many years into their marriage, her hand resting comfortably in his as firelight flickered warmly across the familiar room. "Choosing me that night instead of the revenge you originally intended?" Alaric considered the question for only a brief moment before answering, his voice carrying the same quiet sincerity that had first earned her trust so many years earlier. "I have never once regretted it," he said simply. "Choosing you was the single most important decision of my life, though I did not understand that truth until long after I had already made it. I came seeking revenge and found, instead, the greatest gift I never knew I needed." Lily smiled softly, leaning her head against his shoulder, feeling the same deep, unshakable sense of belonging that had grown steadily within her since the earliest days of their unlikely beginning. Outside, the manor grounds stretched peacefully beneath a gentle evening sky. The same gardens where she had once hidden her pain now filled instead with the quiet, steady evidence of a life fully, genuinely lived. The scars remained, faint and permanent, quiet reminders of everything she had survived. But they no longer defined her, no longer required hiding, no longer carried the weight of shame that had once governed so much of her existence. They had become, simply, part of her story, proof of a strength that had ultimately led her not toward the revenge a bitter stranger once sought, but toward a love deep enough, patient enough, and genuine enough to finally, completely heal every wound that had come before it.